Hey guys, this week we're going to talk about plants and how they reproduce. Specifically, we're going to look at a type of plants called Angiosperms, which are plants that have flowers. Believe it or not, flowering plants are relatively new. We don't see flowering plants in the fossil record until the end of the Cretaceous period, which is towards the end of when dinosaurs were around. So flowers are relatively recent, which means pollinators are also relatively recent because that's a symbiotic relationship and both of those organisms depend upon each other. So that means that bees and butterflies and bats and things like that are all newer organism groups that didn't exist prior to the extinction of dinosaurs. Our less than essential questions for today are: how do plants reproduce? What is the cellular process that produces sperm and egg cells in plants? How do plants reproduce in a way that's similar to humans, and how is this reproductive system different from humans? Think about these questions as we go through the lesson today, and answer them in your notebook as you take notes. Before we get started, I want to talk about the two major groups of plants, and they're separated by their means of reproduction. Both types of plants go through pollination. We know what pollen is and we know what flowers are. You might have even seen pine cones before. So these are all reproductive parts for plants, but there's two major groups, right? There's gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are plants that reproduce by letting out pollen into the atmosphere and just sort of letting wind carry the pollen to other plants. And this pollen, by the way, is a male gametophyte, which just means that it's a male sex cell. Or a particle that carries what will become sex cells eventually. Cones, pine cones for instance, are a specialized female organ for plants, and they will receive pollen and ovulate inside of that protective cone structure. Gymnosperms just make seeds. Angiosperms have flowers that produce fruit and seeds, and these flowers attract pollinators. They don't rely on random chance, is the point here. Pollinators go from flower to flower getting food, and the trade-off is that pollinators are dropping off pollen on these flowers as they travel around. Another thing that angiosperms do that gymnosperms don't do is produce fruit. The goal of fruit is to make seeds travel longer distances. With gymnosperms, once that cone is fertilized and it's ovulated and is producing seeds, the cone will fall to the ground and release those seeds onto the ground. Every once in a while an animal will come along, eat some seeds, and deposit them somewhere else, but it's nowhere near as efficient as having nice, ripe, juicy fruit that's ready there to be eaten for animals. So the purpose of fruit is to take seeds and make them travel far away. None of these things require moving parts. That's the brilliant part of all of this. Plants have no moving parts, but they rely on other organisms that have them to do that same job. So, angiosperms are flowering plants. Let's look at the male parts of a flower. We're focusing on angiosperms for this lesson. So the male part of a flower is called the stamen. By the way, flowers have female and male parts to them, which is sort of weird, but if we remember that the stamen is the male part, and we'll talk about what the female part is in a moment, if we remember that, then we'll have an easier time wrapping our heads around this concept. So the stamen is the name of the male part of the flower, and there's two major portions to this. There's the anther, which produces pollen, and those pollen grains will develop into sperm when the time is right. And then there's the filament, which holds up the anther. So the anther is the real organ here that we're going to focus on. The filament is sort of a support structure. Since the anther is making pollen, it's covered in pollen, and it's very close to wherever the nectar is inside of that flower. And when an animal goes inside of the flower, the anther will brush up against the fuzzy body of a bee or a bat or a bird, for instance, and that pollen will cling to them. And if we look at a pollen grain underneath a microscope, we'll see that it's kind of sticky looking. It has spines on it that make it stick to the fur of animals. Let's talk about the female parts of a flower. So the pistil is the name of the female portion of the flower that does reproductive processes. And we can look at the different segments of this portion. So again, the pistil is the name of that organ. There's the stigma, which is a sticky kind of arm-like structure that pokes out through the middle of the flower. And that stigma, its whole job is to be sticky and to collect pollen from pollinators. So let's say that that bee that we were just talking about, it landed on the male part of one flower, it picked up some pollen, it's going to land on another flower, and the female portion of that is going to be sticky. It's going to grab onto some of that pollen and hopefully fertilize from that process. There is a stalk that holds up the stigma, and it's called the style. And so that stalk is a support structure. It's similar to what we saw with the male flower parts. And it doesn't really have any function beyond that. The goal of this is to guide the pollen down into this next portion of the flower called the ovary. And human beings have ovaries. This is an analogous structure. It's not one that we have a homology with. We don't have a common ancestor that had this structure, but it does the same thing. So ovaries produce egg cells, and those egg cells are waiting to become fertilized. Ovaries also can become fruit in plants that produce fruit. When you eat an apple, you're eating the ovary of a plant. Inside of it is seeds that are not yet fertilized. Okay, inside of the ovary are these things called ovules, which become seeds once sperm cells fertilize them. So we have ovules, which are these specialized plant parts that are waiting for pollen, and once they become fertilized, they develop into seeds. Let's look at some other parts of a flower. Petals are almost universally colorful, and if they're not colorful to you, then they're colorful to the eyes of animals that pollinate those flowers. Bees and birds, for instance, certain species can see into the UV spectrum much farther than we can. And I'll show you some pictures in a second here. So petals are colorful. They're meant to be attractive and super visible in the environment because they're meant to attract organisms towards them. There's the sepal, which is the bud of a young flower, and it looks sort of like a bulb that will open up as the flower matures. Roots are a part of a plant system, obviously, that help bring up water and dissolve minerals to the plant itself for photosynthetic processes. And last but not least, there's the receptacle, which is the portion of the plant that holds on to the flower itself. And these tissues are a little more sturdy and pliable than other cell parts. So let's talk about types of pollination. We already went through what pollination is, which is when an animal takes pollen from one flower and deposits it on another. But there's other types of pollination. So cross-pollination is what we were just talking about. Self-pollination can happen though. So because plants have male and female parts, every once in a while flowers can pollinate themselves. So maybe that bee rubs some of the pollen from a flower onto the female parts of that same flower. A flower can become fertilized with its own pollen, which is a little different than how animals reproduce, for instance. When that happens, it's called self-pollination. When pollination happens in the way that you imagine, it's called cross-pollination. So cross-pollination is sort of sexual reproduction. Self-pollination is asexual reproduction. Things that can make pollination happen, most commonly is animals, like birds, insects, reptiles, mammals. Usually these organisms have some adaptations that make them fuzzy or sticky for pollen. Wind can carry pollen as well. This is how gymnosperms reproduce mostly. They'll release these giant clouds of pollen into the atmosphere, and they'll just let destiny take its course. Water, like during rainstorms, can also carry pollen throughout the environment. Okay, so hopefully we can understand this, that pollination is something that happens in flowers. So in angiosperms, pollination is a process that happens in the flower. The flower is the sexual organ of plants. So the first thing that happens is the anther produces pollen. Then pollen is transferred to the stigma of another flower or its own flower through this pollination process. After pollination occurs, then fertilization happens. So pollen travels down the style to the ovary, where these eggs grow into seeds, and those seeds grow into plants. And you covered the life cycle of plants in elementary school and middle school, so that's where we are. What controls flowering? You might notice that at night flowers can close up, and during the daytime flowers open up. So during daytime plants undergo photosynthesis. Because there's sunlight, they're gathering energy and they're turning it into glucose. At night, however, the flowers close in order for those egg cells to reproduce. in order for flowers to generate. Here's a quick recap of what the different organs of a flower are. Feel free to copy in your notes at your leisure. So that's it for this week. Hopefully you enjoyed the lesson. If you did, like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the buttons.